and welcome to the Driving Net Profit with Zero Emissions podcast. I'm Barbara Albert, co-CEO of 100% Renewables. In today's special episode, we bring you the recording of a recent webinar for local governments, which focuses on taking councils from ambitious targets to action on net zero. In today's recording, we'll explore the journey from climate goals to tangible action, covering key targets at national, state, and local levels. We'll also discuss some common misconceptions around the target jargon and then dive into what makes a credible and actionable net zero strategy. Lastly, we are also introducing our C Campus tool for local governments and a glimpse into the evolving world of mandatory reporting and Scope 3 accounting. So whether you were with us live or are tuning in for the first time, stay with us for an insightful discussion on turning ambition into action. Before we begin, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review if you find this episode helpful. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar From Ambition to Action, in which we will talk about local government commitments and strategies for net zero. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. I'm Barbara Albert, and I co-lead 100% Renewables. Most of you will know about us, but for those of you who don't, we partner with all levels of government and businesses to help them decarbonize. We do this by building carbon footprints and internal capacity, addressing climate risks and opportunities, developing net zero plans, setting targets, and preparing our clients for reporting. We also help reduce our customers' value chain emissions by engaging with them and their suppliers. So a quick intro to me. In addition to co-leading our team, I'm a speaker, I'm a podcast host of the Driving Net Profit with Zero Emissions podcast, and I'm the author of the book Energy Unlimited. In our business, my chief role is the future. What will climate action look like next year, in 3 years, in 5 years? What will our clients need then? How can we help them to respond in a way that positions them to mitigate risk, meet mandatory requirements, manage stakeholder expectations, and most importantly, reduce their emissions? Patrick Denby, or Paddy, is the other speaker and the other half of the founder and CEO role at 100% Renewables. Paddy has nearly 30 years experience in energy efficiency, renewable energy, and carbon management consulting across strategic, policy, and technical areas. At 100% Renewables, Paddy is principally focused on the now or the present. What can we and are we doing to help you respond to the climate change challenge today? Do we have the right skills, the capacity, the expertise? Are we meeting your needs, and where do we need to improve? How can we guide you through the new challenges, opportunities, and requirements that are emerging now to set you up for success in the future? So in our webinar today, which is titled From Ambition to Action, that's what we're going to be focused on. We will look at the ambition part first. We will start with the climate goals for Australia, then move to state level commitments, and then to local government targets, both for council operations as well as for the community. Then we'll discuss the various ambitious targets and what they mean. There's a little bit of confusion out there what the different targets actually mean. For instance, the difference between a net zero goal and a carbon neutral goal. So we'll have a quick chat about that as well. After this, we'll swiftly move from ambition to action, i.e. the development of net zero strategies. We'll look into what makes a net zero plan credible and actionable. After this, we'd like to show you our C Campus tool, which has attracted a lot of attention lately. And we'll look into the next frontier of mandatory reporting and Scope 3 accounting.
So thanks, Barbara. And yeah, obviously covering a lot of ground. So we'll try and move through some of the stuff that you pretty much know as soon as we can. So we'll start Australia at the Commonwealth level. So as we all know, Australia is a signatory to the Paris Agreement, and as a country, we have legislated now our net zero by 2050 ambition through the Climate Change Act 2022. We also have a target to reach 43% emissions reduction on 2005 levels by 2030. But what's next, I guess? So we will learn more about Australia's future emissions reduction commitments next year. So the Climate Change Authority has consulted and is developing its advice in coming months to the government regarding what the level of ambition should be for 2035. And that's required as part of Australia's updated nationally determined contribution, or NDC, which we agreed to as part of our Paris Agreement commitment. So watch this space during 2025. We hope for more ambition, obviously, more support for accelerated action, and less delays or conflicting commitments to fossil fuel developments that hinder progress towards a safe future. Looking across the states and territories, obviously, all states have a Paris-aligned net zero by 2050 target, and that's been the case for some time. Fortunately, in recent years, 4 of 8 state and territory governments have legislated for net zero and interim goals. Unfortunately, Western Australia has shelved its planned climate change bill for now, at least, and we hope that following the election early next year that this is revisited, especially given that Western Australia is where Australia's emissions are rising the most rather than falling. Queensland has legislated a 75% emissions reduction target by 2035, New South Wales 50% by 2030 and 70% by 2035, and Victoria has legislated a target of 45 to 50% reduction by 2030, and South Australia has committed to at least 50% emissions reduction by 2030. In our experience, your state targets, wherever you are important considerations for thinking about your own target. Back to you, Barbara.
So let's have a look at local government targets. We are starting with targets for council operations. Later on, we'll look at targets for the community. We have been monitoring the commitments of local governments in Australia since 2017. We've recently updated the ambitious commitments and found that in total 165 councils out of 537 local governments in Australia have made commitments to net zero emissions. This number covers 31% of all councils. New South Wales takes the lead in absolute numbers of councils committing to ambitious targets, followed closely by Victorian local governments. Looking solely at the number of councils committing to ambitious targets doesn't give the full picture. An equally or more important metric is the fraction of the country's population that is covered by these commitments by councils who are looking to lead the communities by example. 70% of Australia's population is now covered by ambitious commitments. But what do we really mean with ambitious commitments, ambitious targets? At the moment, the criteria for making it onto our list are to have a net zero before 2050 goal. It's relatively easy to align your goal with a net zero target by mid-century made by state government. But committing to reaching net zero earlier than that and committing to interim targets in that timeline shows ambition. In future updates of our blog post, we may introduce additional criteria such as having science-aligned interim targets on the journey to net zero, such as alignment with states' interim goals and Australia's updated 2035 NDC.
So we're looking at ambitious targets that have been set by local councils across Australia. We've got about 9 slides here. I'm going to just flip through them fairly quickly because I can't read them and I don't expect you to be able to read them. So we'll just show them fairly briefly. So first map here is New South Wales metropolitan region. New South Wales, similar to Victoria, has many councils committed to ambitious action on climate. We can't fit them all on one map. So this is just the Sydney metropolitan region, which highlights that there's about 20 or so local councils who've made commitments to reach net zero emissions. If we move then on to regional New South Wales, we can see that whereas perhaps 3 or 4 years ago, we saw most of the ambition in populated areas, and on the east coast of New South Wales, we're increasingly seeing local councils in inland regions, take action on climate, develop emissions reduction plans, and set ambitious targets for emissions reduction within their operations. We see a very similar situation in Victoria. So again, both Victoria metropolitan region and then Victorian councils in regional areas, we're increasingly seeing that ambition extend beyond metropolitan areas and into the regions. I'm pretty sure the last time that we updated our commitments for Queensland, there was just a very small, like 2, maybe 3 local councils, including Brisbane City Council. That's increased in number somewhat, to about 10 councils, but in terms of population coverage, about 72% of the Queensland population lives in these local government areas where commitments to ambitious action on climate have been made. Probably the biggest sort of change from the last time we developed our local government commitments report has been in Western Australia, where we've now got 21 councils across the state have made commitments to action, and that extends around the southwest through the metropolitan area and up into the northern areas, heading towards the the north of Western Australia. Similarly, in South Australia, more than half of the population is covered by targets that have been set predominantly by councils in metropolitan areas around Adelaide. And similarly, a handful of councils in Tasmania, as well as the city of Darwin, have made ambitious commitments to reduce their emissions. So while most local governments are still focusing on their own operations by developing targets and emissions reduction plans for their own operations, but with the increasing need to rapidly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, more and more councils are looking at how they can lead and facilitate carbon mitigation and adaptation and resilience in their communities. In 2017, only 4 councils in Australia had ambitious commitments for their communities. In 2024, we can see that there's now 81 councils and communities who have made ambitious commitments. Some of the questions that we received ahead of the webinar included, look, how are local governments commitments or targets developing in relation to their whole of community missions, and should council and community targets be the same? So we can now see that around half of councils with ambitious operations targets for themselves also have similar goals for their communities, and are seeking to help their communities through education, advocacy, planning, active transport, in some cases financial incentives or support to community initiatives like bulk buys for solar, community batteries and EV charging. Ultimately, council and community goals for emissions reduction are the same, net zero by 2050. We would recommend, I guess, that as states and Commonwealth interim targets are updated, that councils consider adopting these for their communities and continue to advocate for support and to educate and work with their communities to achieve those goals. Councils themselves may actually have harder to abate emissions from sources like waste and heavy fleet, that mean that their pathway to net zero over the long term may in fact be different from their communities. And this should be taken into account when setting and revising targets alongside what your goals or objectives are for your communities. So looking at maps of ambitious community targets that local governments in New South Wales have committed to, there's currently 33 communities that predominantly in the Sydney metropolitan region, with a handful up in the northern part and in some cities in the southwest of the state. Victoria, in fact, probably leads, I guess, in terms of the total number of communities for which ambitious climate action targets or emissions reduction targets have been set, with 34 local government areas in total. In Western Australia, six local government areas. Did I miss a state there? No, I didn't. And 4 community commitments across South Australia, also in that metropolitan region, have been set by councils on behalf of their communities.
So many councils have set ambitious climate targets like you've seen, but the terminology around these targets can be really confusing and can create tricky challenges for some councils. Terms like net zero and carbon neutral are often used interchangeably, even though they have distinct meanings. This clarity in the meaning of these terms has come about relatively recently, and we still commonly see near-term net zero goals, for example, that have assumed carbon offsets would be a large part of achieving these goals. We also see climate active, carbon neutral ambitions, perhaps before the intricacies, price volatility, and integrity of carbon offsets were well understood, not to mention Scope 3 emissions. This lack of clarity can make it difficult to understand what a commitment really entails and how to plan for it. So let's break down the jargon to provide clarity and help you set and communicate your targets effectively. Let's start with net zero first. Imagine a seesaw. On the left side, we place a large block representing our greenhouse gas emissions, which weighs the seesaw down heavily. To achieve net zero, our first step is to reduce the weight on the left side by cutting emissions as much as possible. This reduction involves addressing all feasible sources, leaving only the most challenging or costly emissions, those that are hard to eliminate. Once emissions are reduced as much as possible, the remaining small carbon footprint, those emissions that are hard or expensive to eliminate, can be balanced with carbon offsets. In a net zero world, these offsets must be removal-based carbon credits, meaning they come from projects that actively remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. These projects ensure that the amount of carbon removed matches the residual emissions, and this is a net zero balance. As opposed to net zero, carbon neutral is a bit different. Carbon neutrality typically applies to balancing emissions with offsets over a defined period, often without the need to reduce emissions. I'd also like to throw in the target 100% renewable. On the left side of the seesaw, you can see your energy consumption. So the focus here is on energy, not on emissions. And to reach 100% renewable, you balance your energy consumption with renewables, either by supplying your energy demand from renewables with solar, for instance, or balancing your energy consumption by an equal production of renewable energy. Let's move on from targets to designing your net zero strategy. A target or your ambition is only part of the equation. You need to move from ambition to action and then ultimately to accountability. In order for you to take a strategic and rounded approach, you should not only focus on decarbonizing council operations and responding to climate-related risks and opportunities, but also on contributing to a community-wide transition. The way you can do this is by using the levers and capabilities you have available to accelerate the transition to net zero. You can do this by active lobbying with state government and by supporting your community to move to a net zero economy. To help you design your net zero strategy, we've got something special for you. All webinar participants will get access to our net zero strategy framework for local governments. This framework is built around the 5 C's framework that we developed, being carbon foundations, climate risks and opportunities, climate strategy, commitment, and collaboration. which in turn is aligned with mandatory reporting requirements of the private sector. So the framework will help ensure your plan is comprehensive, transparent, and actionable. You can see the Net Zero implementation checklist, which is part of this document. It's part of the framework. And as a thank you for attending, we'll send you the PDF after the webinar. And we hope you'll find that useful. We've also put together 10 tips to help you create credible and actionable net zero plans. Here is tip number 1. Start with low-hanging fruit to build organizational confidence. Begin with actions that are easier and quicker to implement, like energy efficiency upgrades or switching to renewable energy. Achieving early wins helps build momentum, it demonstrates success, and it boosts confidence across your council. Tip number 2. Your net zero strategy should cover the whole organization and value chain. So you should not exclude any emission sources that are material to you and your impact on the natural environment. For councils, this means that you should not only keep track of and reduce direct fuel burn and your purchased electricity, but also emissions in your value chain, such as street lighting or the embodied emissions in construction materials. Tip number 3. If net zero targets are set years into the future, councils may feel they have plenty of time and defer action. However, early action is critical to achieving your net zero goals. By starting now, you can spread investments over time, you can reduce long-term risks, and take advantage of emerging technologies and funding opportunities. Fleet and waste emissions can seem insurmountable as the solutions are small, not yet technologically or commercially available, or not fit for purpose for your operations. Mapping out the feasible and possible solutions and their impact over time can allow you to start with the things you can do, progress over time to adopt emerging solutions, and deal with the hard-to-abate emissions in the longer term. This planning can also help make you more grant-ready and able to accelerate action with support. Tip number 4. Focus on cutting emissions within your operations and supply chain first. Use high-integrity carbon credits only to support mitigation efforts outside your direct operations and supply chain, such as reforestation projects. Remember, these credits can't replace real emission reductions and should only cover emissions that are hard to eliminate. Tip number 5. Measuring your progress is essential for understanding how well you're advancing towards net zero. It helps you identify successes, pinpoint areas needing improvement, and demonstrate accountability to your community. Choose clear, measurable indicators like tons of emissions that you've reduced or the percentage of suppliers you've engaged with to track your net zero journey. Tip number 6. Break your net zero goal into manageable 5-year targets to maintain momentum and track progress. You can pick your own targets, follow a science-based reduction pathway, or align your target with state or Commonwealth goals. Tip number 7. Integrate your net zero plan into your council's reporting framework and also into your decision-making processes, and assign clear oversight roles. Invest in capacity building by training staff and councillors to understand and implement climate actions. If organizational circumstances allow, regularly reporting and updating executive teams or committees can ensure your net zero ambition stays on track and is effectively delivered. Tip number 8. Ensure your net zero plan is backed by a dedicated budget for emissions reduction projects. We were asked what alternate revenue streams can be explored to fund climate actions within the organization and across the community. You can consider setting up a revolving energy fund where savings from energy efficiency, fleet efficiency, or solar project are reinvested into new initiatives, creating a sustainable funding cycle for ongoing decarbonization. Be across grant opportunities for your council and community, and collaborate in your region or joint organization to get access to grants that can deliver on your regional energy and climate objectives. Tip number 9, incorporate strategies to prepare for and adapt to climate impacts such as extreme weather, rising temperatures, or supply chain disruptions. Building resilience ensures your council can maintain services, protect infrastructure, and support the community as the climate continues to change. And finally, tip number 10, mandatory reporting isn't here yet for the public sector, but it's potentially on the way, as flagged by ASIC and as consultation progresses to recommendations on public sector sustainability and climate-related disclosures by IPSASB, which the Australian Accounting Standards Board may consider. Get ahead by adopting robust emissions tracking and reporting practices now. Align with frameworks like the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards, ASRS, to ensure you're ready for future requirements and to build credibility with your community. I've got something exciting to share which can help you on your net zero journey. We have built a tool called Sea Compass that helps councils track their progress towards net zero. About half of New South Wales councils are currently using the tool with the support of the New South Wales government. We built the tool to overcome typical carbon accounting challenges for councils. I don't know whether you can relate, but in many cases, the calculation of emissions can be periodic or not carried out at all. Measurement of all emissions that are relevant to councils is challenging with some large non-traditional sources such as landfill and wastewater emissions. There are great online solutions available, but they can be potentially expensive, particularly for resource-constrained councils. Capacity is also often limited in councils to measure and track total emissions, and this is especially the case with Scope 3 emissions that are often poorly understood and not tracked.
So with Sea Compass, and as Barbara indicated, this has been developed with support of New South Wales Government. It's been predominantly, or it developed or arose out of work with a number of regional New South Wales councils, and the extension of it to other councils is also predominantly in regional and remote areas. So we're really starting, or we're looking to provide a tool, a simple tool that councils can use to access their data or to know where to go to get the data. In all of the training sessions that we've run on Sea Compass, this has probably attracted the most attention. The provision of useful guidance on what data do we need to capture all of our Scope 1 and 2 emissions, where does that data live, who owns it, and how do I get hold of it, and importantly, tracking and recording all of those information so that if or as resources or people in council change from time to time, that there's a clear record of where that information can be obtained from and what the ideal sources for that are. The application of emission factors by the Sea Compass tool then simply leads to the calculation of the emissions at a grossed up level. We're not within the data collection looking to replace any other tools or systems. We just recognize that all councils are where they are at. They may have spreadsheets, they may have a platform that collects data for them, they may still be relying on bills, or they may be able to approach a retailer or a supplier. It simply looks to prompt and help them to get that information, and then with that information they can calculate their carbon footprint. They can look at those trends in their carbon footprint over time, which they can use to communicate to your council, tell your community, apply for and be successful with grant applications, and hopefully and ideally meet their targets for emissions reduction. The aim of Sea Compass is to provide guidance on developing a carbon footprint, regardless of your experience or your budget for carbon management. So it measures and tracks or helps councils to track a broad range of emission sources specific to local governments, and in particular local governments in regional areas, including fuel, electricity, gas, and sources that are often overlooked, in particular landfill gas emissions and wastewater emissions. So tool is designed to focus on those most common scope 1 and 2 emission sources and ensure that the key contributors to council's carbon footprint are accurately captured without overwhelming users at this stage with every possible source of scope 1 and 2 emissions. Probably easily the biggest revelation out of work that we've been doing with regional local governments is that, not surprisingly, waste is the single biggest contributor to emissions for local governments in regional areas where they have landfills, typically between 50 to 70% of total scope 1 and 2 emissions for most regional councils. Higher where no gas capture or very small regional landfills are being used, typically at the lower end where gas capture is in place. One of the projects that we've been working on initially with funding from the New South Wales EPA and together with the Hunter Joint Organisation, we've been developing work to measure landfill emissions more accurately using the NGR solid waste calculator tool and developing a capacity package initially for councils in the Hunter and Central Coast region. So we identified that measurement of emissions from waste was a gap. We've developed a mastering landfill emissions with the NGR calculator package, as part of which we completed NGR solid waste calculators for 10 councils within the Hunter and Central Coast region of New South Wales, an online platform to visualize abatement scenarios associated with those emissions from landfill is being developed. It's just about finalized. With a Power BI front end that enables councils to play around with different scenarios relating to gas capture, FOGO, closure of landfills, and there's also an opportunities report being developed for the EPA that identifies barriers that councils face in reducing landfill emissions and opportunities for New South Wales EPA to help overcome some of those barriers. An extension of that work has been that we're currently working with, or almost finalized working with, data for a further 50 landfills across New South Wales and developing emissions profiles using the NGR solid waste calculator for those landfills as well. So just through that work with 60 landfills, we're sort of getting a really good profile on emissions, or 80% of the emissions from waste across New South Wales. So that's just a snapshot of some of the resources and the Power BI front end of the scenario dashboard tool that just helps to visualize the impacts of different abatement levers on emissions from waste across New South Wales. Ahead of the webinar, we were asked, are there technologies to capture all fugitive emissions from waste? And we're also asked to comment on waste management for smaller and geographically isolated councils. So part of the work that we have been doing with New South Wales EPA and with local councils has been to get an idea of thresholds below which some common abatement solutions might be unviable, and where alternate solutions like biofilters and phytocapping might be better applied, and then to understand also where there might be a case for mixed solutions that combine two or more abatement approaches for mitigating emissions from landfill. So this work with the EPA is continuing at this time. Certainly future approaches won't only need to consider the technology solutions, but also what are the best approaches for remote and very small landfills, including what kinds of collaborations might need to occur between local councils, regional waste bodies, and the state government. Clearly, the biggest challenge in terms of emissions reduction for regional local governments, and Sea Compass helps to sort of bring that profile in and help local councils track emissions from waste over time, and acknowledge it as one of the key challenges for emissions reduction for them.
All right. So, armed with all this information about waste, I just wanted to quickly summarize the key benefits of the C Campus tool. Firstly, it helps with comprehensive emissions tracking. The tool captures many different emission sources, including those from landfills and wastewater. Secondly, it facilitates reporting and action planning because it improves the accuracy and comprehensiveness of emissions data. You can better report on your progress towards emission reduction targets, and you can plan more effective climate actions. Thirdly, the interface is easy to use, essential for councils with limited capacity. C Campus can also be extended with Scope 3 emissions, which we are planning for our future versions. Please get in touch with us if you want to find out more. So, after having heard all of that, what is the next frontier in the net zero journey for councils? Let's start with Scope 3 accounting. Understanding and managing Scope 3 emissions is a journey that usually progresses through several key stages. The journey typically starts with mastering Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. This stage focuses on building internal capacity to measure and report direct and energy-related emissions. Next, what typically happens is that you broaden your focus to include upstream and downstream emissions. This means looking at your value chain, such as your contract of fuel or purchase goods and services, and to understand how these emissions contribute to your overall carbon footprint. You then create an initial map of your Scope 3 emissions by developing an initial carbon footprint based on estimation methods. Next in the journey is that councils typically refine their data by focusing on material categories and hotspots, such as construction materials, replacing estimates with more accurate activity-based data. And then finally, councils will engage with the value chain to collect high-quality data and replace estimates with more accurate data and ensure that the reporting is ready to be validated. Now, here's an example of how you can replace your estimates for emissions from purchased goods and services over time. So that's category 1 in the Scope 3 scope of carbon emissions. Typically, what most councils do at this stage that look into Scope 3 emissions is that they start with translating from expenditure data to associated emissions. But over time, you'll replace some of those estimates by obtaining the weight of certain materials, such as asphalt, cement, steel. After that, you may start replacing some of your estimates with real data from your suppliers. So you'll start collaborating with your supply chain to get the actual data from them. And eventually, this requires system-wide change. Eventually, you'll replace your estimates with product carbon footprints or service carbon footprints directly obtained from your suppliers. So that's the most specific method you could use, and that's what's going to be ahead of you in your journey of Scope 3 accounting once you start turning your attention to that.
So the next frontier, I guess, beyond Scope 3 reporting is potentially mandatory reporting. We had a question ahead of the webinar: when will mandatory reporting likely be introduced for councils? And I've had that same question asked probably about 20 times over the last 6 months. And we're also asked if there is potential for local councils to be compelled by state or federal government to assist with helping to meet their legislated net zero targets in future. So I guess we don't know the answer to that right now, but there's a few things happening that indicate that preparation for mandatory reporting now is probably a wise course of action. So in the ASIC, the draft regulatory guide associated with the mandatory sustainability reporting, ASIC has highlighted in sort of point E at the bottom of this regulatory guide 000 that the public sector and other agencies will report under a variation of the sustainability standard. So ASIC is certainly flagging that some form of mandatory reporting in the public sector will be required. We're also, as are others, sort of following the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board, or IPSASB's first sustainability reporting standard exposure draft, and the consultation process that's underway in relation to that. We know that the AASB, the Australian Accounting Standards Board, is monitoring that process fairly closely. And the expectation is that following the consultation process and consideration of comments, that in the second half of 2025, there'll be recommendations out of IPSASB that may flow through to how sustainability disclosures are framed and applied nationally in Australia. So we're certainly keeping an eye on that. For reference, I guess, in relation to the incoming mandatory Australian sustainability reporting standards that will come into force from the 1st of January this year. So entities covered under that legislation will obviously come in across 3 years as Group 1, Group 2 and Group 3 entities, and they will have to make a range of disclosures that are, come under governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and targets. So governance means how climate-related risks and opportunities are overseen by the leadership of organizations and their decision-making bodies. The strategy means what are the actual and potential impacts of climate risks and opportunities on a business operations, services, and planning. Risk management, they have to make a range of disclosures there, and risk management refers to the processes via which an organization identifies, assesses, and then manages climate-related risks across their activities and infrastructure. And lastly, under metrics and targets, what are the key indicators and goals that an organization uses to measure and track climate-related performance, such as emissions reduction and resilience efforts? So that's a framework that's coming into force from 1 January next year, so in about 2 weeks' time, for very large organizations, and that will filter down through to organizations of around 100 persons, for example, and $50 million in income. So not very large. So there might be a reasonable expectation that future public sector reporting could extend to organizations of a similar size, which is where we think, some state government agencies and potentially local government entities may come in under any future regime.
And that brings us to the end of the last episode of the Driving Net Profit with Zero Emissions podcast for 2024. A huge thank you to everyone who joined us for the webinar and in this episode. If you have any questions, or if there's a topic you'd like us to explore in the future episode, do reach out to us via info@100%renewables.com.au. We love hearing from our listeners. Until next time.